This episode of UK Low Carb Podcast is sponsored by Deliciously Guilt-Free. Enjoy the show.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of UK Low Carb, and a really special episode because today I'm joined by Professor Tim Noakes. Just for those people who haven't heard this podcast before, this is UK Low Carb. I'm your host, Dan Grief, and this is a podcast where we share individual stories, all those N=1 stories out there to help build the low carb community, not just here in the UK, but also around the world. So we're linking arms today with, of course, Professor Tim Noakes in South Africa, but I've also spoken to people from all across the world, and it's growing. This movement is growing. Now, change always happens from people standing together and really getting their stories heard and then sharing that with other people and convincing one person, two people at a time about the amazing benefits of the low carb way of life. And this podcast hopes to try to be part of that movement for change. Now, before I go into today's show, I just have a quick question for you. And that was, were you part of the Gen Clubhouse group this week with Tom Watson? If you weren't, then you really missed out on something incredibly special. So for those people who don't know, Clubhouse is an app. It's an audio-based app where you are able to go to different talks with different people and you can contribute with the conversation. Now, Tom Watson was in Fork in the Road, which is Gen group, and he was sharing his health story and answering questions. I really highly recommend that group. If you did miss this one, then there's another Clubhouse meeting on Wednesday, 6 p.m. UK time with John Unwin and Dr. David Unwin as well. So you're more than welcome, I'm sure, to join that if you're on that app. Now, before I get into today's podcast with Professor Tim Noakes, I have a really special review to share with you. And that is as follows. Proof that the quality of the interview is determined by the quality of the person conducting the interview. Thanks, Dan at UK Low Carb. You are the best. And that's from Professor Tim Noakes. So don't want to blow the trumpet too much, but I was over the moon when I read that. Thank you so much to you, Tim. I really appreciate your feedback. And he tweeted that just after this recording you're about to hear in a moment. So, without much further ado, before I get into things with Professor Tim Noakes, I just want to say they tell you never to meet your heroes, but actually I can confirm that in this case, then that they, whoever they are wrong, because it was absolutely amazing meeting Tim Noakes. I can't believe that I've actually had the privilege of spending time talking to him. It was amazing. It was more than I could have ever expected. He's not only a huge icon in the world of sports science and nutrition, but also the fact that he stood up against the vested interest, and he not only just won a court case, but also the appeal hands down completely. But throughout the whole experience, he still remained the fun, warm person that you all know him to be. And when you see him in videos and whatnot, and you kind of think, wow, he seems like a genuinely nice person, in reality, he's just like that. That is genuinely him. So it's a great privilege to be able to talk to him. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And this is part one of my conversation with Professor Tim Noakes. I hope you enjoy it. Have a lovely weekend, everyone. And then next Friday, there'll be a bit more. So that's my jibber jabber done. Now let's hand over to Professor Tim Noakes. Well, it's my great pleasure to welcome somebody I've wanted to have on the show for a long, long time. And in fact, somebody who has influenced me from the very beginning. I think when Bess, my wife, first had gestational diabetes, yours was one of the very first videos that we watched. And I was like, who's this guy? What's this all about? And now I'm talking to you in person. So it's my great privilege and honor to say thank you and welcome to Professor Tim Noakes to UK Low Carb.
Thank you so much. Lovely to be with you and to your UK listeners.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
well, you're well known to, and by the way, later on there's some questions, and so many people were asking questions, and some of them are actually part of doing your courses as well, and so as part of your program. So I know you're very well known here, a bit of a rock legend in the community. So I'm just going to start really with talking about the first thing, which is the trial. Now, I don't know you personally, but you come across as being one of the most pleasant, likable people ever. And yet you've been through a really hard time. And I think that's interesting. And I wanted to just go into that a little bit. So
Yeah,
how did you manage to go through that trial where your whole integrity is at question and yet you still remain positive? And I don't know, and I don't want to necessarily ask if you have moved on and forgiven and forgotten, but how do you manage to keep positive when you went through all of that?
Yeah, I think on the outside, I was always positive. And on the outside, I think I hid all the trauma that was happening inside. And it was really only after it had completed and finished that I started to get mild symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, And I only recognized it because, for example, when I won the first series of the case and then it went to appeal, the moment I had to think about it again, I got quite a bad depression. And for about 6 months after I won the appeal, which was in July 2018, for about 6 months thereafter, if anything came up about the trial, I'd get that same response. So although I was extremely positive throughout the trial, I definitely, my wife, you asked my wife, she knew I was under duress. I was fortunate that I had an unbelievable group of people supporting me, from my wife to my legal team, were just astonishing. And particularly Rocky Ramdas, who was a medical doctor and who we became so close. He's now my brother. We actually enjoyed the trial because he was
at the time or just post the event.
Yeah, in fact, during the trial, we really enjoyed it because I was on the stand for 9.5 days.
Wow.
And so for 6 of those days, he led my evidence, and we just had a fantastic time. And then I was cross-examined for 3.5 days, and that was a little bit tougher, but it was so funny because we became so close that he would prepare me for cross-examination, and in the end, the cross-examination was pathetic compared to what he'd put me through. So that was
prepared you for
the reason I got through it. But I also knew that we were fighting for the truth, and I knew that what I was saying was true. So unless the system was completely corrupted, I knew we had to win.
Which is always a worry. That's always a worry, I would have thought.
Win.
That must always be a worry, that when you're facing this sort of situation, you're talking about very big vested interests who are fighting against you. Would the trial actually be fair? And I suspect that with maybe a different, was it a judge? Would you call the lady? Was that her role, or what's the distinction in South Africa?
She wasn't a judge. She's an attorney, and she was right. Yeah, she was judging. There were 5 guys on the committee that judged me. And they were appointed by the Health Professionals Council, which is a government institution, obviously.
Right.
And the Health Professional Council had charged me. So, and then they appoint the committee to judge me.
Wow.
So that tells you what risk there is. And Joan Adams was the lead judge, as you called her. And she's impervious to anything. She just sees the truth. So we were lucky we had her. And we were lucky that there was one other person who knew me quite well. And so we knew there were 2 honest people on the committee, so that it would be difficult to get a decision against us. But it's still, they still had to convince 2 of the other 3, which we finally did. Yeah.
Wow. So those who don't know, the tweet that is a tweet exchange, which, I mean, back in 2014, the world has changed quite a lot since then. I mean, we've even had a president since then who's used it as a main way to announce policy for his cabinet to learn about. But the tweet was in answer, I think, to a woman asking about weaning a baby. And you said, baby doesn't eat the dairy and cauliflower, just a very healthy, high-fat breast milk. Key is to wean baby onto LCHF. Now, we've all tweeted things. We've never expected to have then 4.5 years of trial and court case. But I just want to say, you weren't her doctor, and you also didn't know this woman, did you?
Yeah. And I was answering a we question, and that was the key point, that the prosecution claimed I was in a doctor-patient relationship, but we very quickly proved that if I was in a doctor-patient relationship, the lady who was accusing me, she was also in the doctor-patient relationship, because she had actually prescribed direct evidence, and she'd consulted with this lady, and so she'd also stolen my patient. So she was guilty of
the irony.
And it was so funny because the opening day of the trial, you see, or actually it wasn't, because the opening day we had to go away for another 6 months. But anyway, when the trial really opened, and this poor lady who'd laid the complaint got up there, and she faced Mike van der Nest, one of the cleverest lawyers in South Africa. And he just pointed out to her that she had superseded me. So therefore she had broached the rules of the Health Professions Council of South Africa. So what did she say to that? And she just went pale.
Wow. So she's out of depth, really. She didn't realize that actually, if you go down this route, everyone is potentially in trouble. But what I don't understand about the case, which is really interesting, is the nature. So I've done a lot of research into this because I wanted to know more about the actual case. And the fact that this wasn't really about the role of doctors and patients, but rather it became about low carb advice being acceptable to give. Now, I know from teaching politics and being in politics the South African constitution is one of the best in the world. It really protects rights very, very well. And it's interesting, they didn't argue on the case of you're a doctor, you shouldn't have done this. But in the end, it became more about low carb was on trial. How did that happen?
Yeah, because they threw everything into the charge. The charge was that it acted unconventionally by giving that I was guilty of unprofessional conduct because I had promoted unconventional dietary advice. And that was the problem, because they had two arguments. The one was the ethical issue, that it was doctor-patient relationship. And the second one was the dietary information was false. Now, if they'd gone on just on the ethical side, they would have had a stronger case, because as soon as they introduced the diet, we said, okay, that's it, we'll kill them. We'll kill them with the evidence. And we presented 7,000 pages of scientific evidence. And they presented one scientific paper, which we think was fraudulent. But anyway,
okay.
So, and then eventually they changed the charge again. Then eventually the charge became that I was going to kill millions of patients with this advice. But the irony was that the lady who wrote the South African dietary guidelines was the chief prosecution witness. And she'd written the guidelines, and the guidelines specifically state that I'm correct. They specifically state that you must wean onto meat, fish, dairy, eggs, at least once a day or as often as possible.
So conventional means it's based on those guidelines. Those guidelines say what you said. So their case was flawed before they even started then. They had no hope really on that basis.
Absolutely. And the World Health Organization is exactly the same. The dietary guidelines are exactly the same. South Africa only follows but the problem was that the International Life Sciences Institute, of which this lady, she was involved with them, is an organization. It's a front organization for Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, and other big organizations. And she had been the president of ILSI South Africa. And so she was under their control, as were two of the other key witnesses. So in the end, it became clear that what was big industry or big food was trying to attack me, to shut me up, because that's what their function is. And she was just a spokesperson for that organization. She was forgotten what her dietary guidelines were, or the organization has said, listen, you just got to forget that. This is what you got to do.
But I don't understand something. And this is, I think, the most painful part of all of this that probably worries all of us. The knife was wielded by your university, who, and just to put this into context, it's not like you worked for your university for a couple of years in a junior position. You built up a department. You made that university on the map. I'm British, so I'm not very impressed with your rugby career. It's in what you've done to us there. Thanks very much. And I also know you've said that everyone supports the opposing team to England. So, so you're already in trouble on this one. But just want to say, as far as your university is concerned, you've done so much for them. That must be pretty painful that they were the ones who really put the knife in.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I'd worked at the university for 45 years, including my training. And I built up, as you said, an institute from nothing. I started with absolutely nothing. And when I retired, or was forced to retire, I know that sports science was one of the 3 world-class institutions at the University of Cape Town. So I built it from nothing to world-class. And today I am the 3rd most cited living sports scientist.
Wow.
And I wonder how many other university professors at the University of Cape Town have got similar status. Then they wrote this letter, and the letter came directly from industry. So what I learned was, and I work with my son very closely because he's been tracking how the University of Cape Town used social media to attack me. That's how bad it gets. They may not have done it directly, but there were people at the university who were doing it. So he's tracked that, and he said, and I had to give a lecture, and we came across the idea of embedded scientists versus autonomous science. And that's the difference. And my problem was that I went against embedded science. And embedded science is controlled by industry. It's either pharmaceutical industry or big food, or plus the military industrial complex. But in my case, it was big food and big pharma. Because I also spoke out against statin drugs. So that was worrying.
Which is a massive industry, isn't it? Huge industry.
Absolutely. So they were the ones who went after me. And I believe they went directly to the university and they said, listen, Noakes is harming our sales, or particularly of statins, because it started with statins. And they would have said, you've got to take him out. And the first letter that appeared in 2012 in the local newspaper was from the professor of cardiology, saying that I was being dangerous because I was killing patients. I was telling them to stop taking their statins, which I hadn't said. But that was their story, and that I'd become a cholesterol denialist, like the AIDS denialist. Wow. And so I was linked to that. And I asked him, I said, tell me, have you ever read any of the books about cholesterol and the fact that it doesn't cause heart disease? And he just went blank. He just had no comment.
That's incredible, because you know what? You sort of think of universities as having a higher calling, a higher purpose. And I think that does. I was going to ask you another question about the trial first, but I was going to ask you this other question, which I think relates to that. When did consensus replace science, and why? Because it is shocking, isn't it? So, I live in Cambridge, very much a university town, and I like to think that my wife, who's doing a PhD right now, and others, they're on a mission to try and find the truth, and I hope they are. But from the food nutrition side, I see there's been an incredible amount of consensus over science, because the questioning is bad, the consensus building is correct, and that's completely out of whack with what I'd expect.
Yeah. That's not science. Yeah. Now, once science becomes embedded or politicized, it's not science anymore. So I think it starts when the pharmaceutical industry starts directing what's being done in the universities. And that really begins in the 1990s, when Reagan in the United States says that if anyone who's working can take the patent, they can claim the patent for the university. Whereas before it wasn't. The patent was held by the NIH, as I understand it. So it was held by the US government. Right. But now they handed it over to the universities. And what the pharmaceutical industry realized was that they could make a lot of money by just investing in the universities, because then they didn't have their own infrastructure and staff, etc. But what came with that was that they controlled the outcomes, so that the research became output driven. And the goal was to promote the product sales. I mean, all pharmacological research, all it says about advertising this product over that product, and so it'll sell more. That's in a nutshell what the pharmaceutical industry does. And so they control the outcome. Whereas in science, you don't want to know what the outcome is, and you're trying to disprove it anyway. You're trying to disprove your beliefs. So consensus has got.
It's funny you say that, because this is why I put you and David Unwin in a very similar category here. You could retire at the very end of a very successful career saying, I was right the whole time, look at how amazing I am. But somebody to say, well, actually, let's just go back and realize that what I did there was incorrect, and I've now found the data to go against it. Now, that's science, but it can go against human ego. And actually, human ego can really get in the way there. And I think the people who have questioned that, I think, are more powerful, because actually science is on their side. They'll be remembered for longer for the fact that they are finding the truth. But that must have been hard for you. I mean, I know the story of when you found, the Finney book in... Was it 2012 or something? And how that must have, you did have a human ego reaction at first, right? Until you realized that the science led you in a different direction.
Actually, it took about 3 hours.
3 hours, there you go, better than some.
I read the book and I just said, unbelievable. I couldn't believe, but I was ready for it, because I was in such a bad physical shape and I was looking for some solution. And then I found the solution, or at least I found this, okay, I've been doing it wrong. Let me try this. And I tried it, and literally within 2 days, I started feeling better. And within 6 weeks, my running had gone back 20 years. I went back to feeling like a 40-year-old and running as fast as I had 20 years earlier. Amazing. So all this progression and getting slower, I thought it was age. It was nothing. It was my diabetes and the insulin resistance and the diet. So to me, it was an absolute miracle. And now I'm 71 3/4. I shouldn't be here. My dad died 10 years after the diagnosis. I've had the diagnosis for well over 10 years, but I don't have any complications as far as I know. And I'm look pretty healthy, and I'm really enjoying life. So to me, it's a second life. I've been given the second opportunity at life. Yeah.
That's incredible. And I was just thinking, when you said about your father's death, how you realized, I think you said in another podcast, that he would have loved to do a low carb lifestyle if he knew about it, because it's natural for him. And that comes up in this podcast all the time. And I'm sure you hear it as well. People say, oh, I can now eat the diet that I've always wanted to eat. And one thing I talk about is, when I was growing up, you'd have the lamb chop, and I was told, don't eat the fat on the edge of the chop. And I'd be eating it little bit by little because I really wanted it. And then when you find out that's the good bit, you're like, brilliant, let's dive in and eat the chop and just ignore the rest of the meal. And it is liberating in that way, isn't it? doesn't it? It really does sort of
Absolutely.
change your perspective on how you function and how food functions.
By the way, I must say, I think, my parents are both from Liverpool, and my mother's father was involved in the meat industry, and they used to provide meat to the ships going from Liverpool to New York.
Right.
And that was their business. So my mother loved meat, and she raised me on a meat diet, high meat diet.
And then you're the one coming out with all the carb stuff later. So she must have been horrified for a while, going, "What's these kids getting into?"
But it's even worse than that, because my sister in 1965 goes to Britain in a swimming and is in London and discovers the low carb diet, because it was, I think, it was one of the very first books, The Drinking Man's Diet. And she used it. And she's been on the Banting diet since 1965. So how many years is that? And eventually, when I came round to it, she said, I've been on this diet for whatever, 50 odd years. I said, why didn't you tell me? She said, no, because you're the expert. I wasn't going to tell you what to do.
I love that. You're the expert with pre-diabetes who's,
right.
giving yourself an early grave.
And she's 76 and she's got perfect health. And she never got diabetes.
That's amazing. Have you got a number? I'll give her a call after this. It sounds like she's got a heck of a story to tell. This is amazing. And you know what? I think that does relate to what we're coming across. And you said something at one of the conferences I heard where you said, a bit like El Alamein, where Montgomery is getting his troops ready for battle. I'm a historian, so I love Second World War history in particular. And you said, he said, sorry, we're just getting the troops ready, the generals in place, everything ready to go. And that really made me think of a mental image of this is like, there's going to be a tipping point at some point. And I was going to say, when is that, do you think, going to happen? When I know that's hard to predict the future, but do you feel now in your journey that we're closer to that now than ever? Or do you think it's still some way to go until we just tip over the consensus?
Well, Robert Lustig said it's going to take 30 years and we're about 9 years into it. So he's got another 21 years to go.
There's a lot of people suffering in the meantime, though, aren't there?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. It depends how quickly the general public realizes how badly they've been misled. That is critical. Yeah. And I'll tell you, one of the factors that is definitely coming out is that the doctors are burning out. And doctors are burning out because they can't cure their patients. And so that if another diabetic patient comes, they know that the outcome is terrible for that patient. And they know they're going to see them every 3 months for the rest of their life. And all they're going to do is increase the medications. Now, that's not nice to have to treat patients like that. Whereas eventually the doctors are going to realize that we've got the solution and we can cure those patients. And that will take the load off the doctors. So doctor burnout is one of the key drivers of change, I suspect. But also, when I speak to young medical students and tell them the story, they get it just like that. It's amazing.
Right. That's good.
As long as you get to the medical students before the 3rd or 4th year, you can change, you can imprint this new idea. And I spoke to them and I said, imagine if South Africa's got a lot of HIV, obviously. And I say, imagine if a cure came up for HIV tomorrow and you didn't know about it and it was published and you didn't know about it. What would you say? I said, what about diabetes? Diabetes in this country is a bigger problem than HIV. And what if there was a cure and you didn't know about it? Well, I said, but we do have a cure and you don't know about it and you're not being told about it. And why is that?
It's shocking.
Yeah.
But then our health system in the UK, the National Health Service, is on its knees in some regards. And I can see that the argument, if you ask the wrong question, you get the wrong answer. So if the question in the end becomes, let's privatize healthcare because that'll fix the problem, well, that's just going to be a different way of trying to plaster over the cracks, which I don't think would be as good. Was actually, if we just try to, and this is what this podcast is about, grassroots movements for change, that we can change the way that people buy and eat and the way that they treat food in their bodies so they don't get sick. They have a long health span, not just a long lifespan, which seems to be the question we don't ask ourselves in this society about having a longer, happier life.
And the answer, the reason why we don't in medicine is because medicine is controlled by the pharmaceutical industry and it's embedded science. And if you question that, you lose everything, as I did. They took me on. And that's the problem. For example, if you're a professor of diabetology or endocrinology, you have to prescribe insulin. If you don't prescribe insulin, you lose all your benefits. Jeez. And so the moment you say, oh, I've got another solution, it's a low carb diet and you don't need insulin, then they stop funding your research. And so you can't travel around the world and you don't get the perks for your department. I mean, I know how this works. And so You'll never find a professor of endocrinology talking low carbs. They absolutely cannot.
That's incredible. You know what? So I'm involved in politics and I've stood for Parliament here in the UK. And I
Yes.
know MPs who do low carb, but they keep quiet about it. And I'm like,
Yeah.
well, why? You've lost weight, you're healthier, you look 10 years younger. Why don't you say anything? And they never answer the question. And I just think, is there pressure at all levels that same with GPs in this country who, they actually tell their patients privately, very quietly about low carb, but they're so terrified of being outed in some way and getting in trouble. It's incredible. I just think the more individuals we get, the more N=1s we get, stories out there to say this happened, this happened, this happened, the more chance we have of changing it. But it's a heck of a powerful force we're fighting against. It's really going uphill and pushing water at the same time.
Well, the food industry is worth trillions, and is the pharmaceutical industry. And if we went low carb, 3 pharmaceutical industries would go out of business. 3 companies would go out of business.
My heart
and
breaks.
they couldn't sell any more insulin. And so they're going to make sure that the insulin story, or the no need for insulin story, never gets out. They have to do it. That's what they're there for.
But then when they try to take you on, and this whole case shows that in the end it didn't succeed, did it? And they didn't manage to get their own way on that one, which is good. And I think that's a beacon to say that, look, it's okay to keep fighting. As long as you've got truth on your side, then that gives you a heck of an advantage. Just out of interest, what was the true cost of the court case? Not just in terms of money, but also the impact on you and the other people involved, because it must have been quite a huge cost, that.
Yeah, the cost was close to £1 million.
Right, £1 million.
Now, that wasn't all my cost. My costs, of course, were nowhere near that. But that was the government's cost, were at least 3/4 or more of that.
Wow.
So that gives you an idea. And it was obviously completely wasted because they didn't make the case. But in terms of the personalities and the cost to our emotions, our mental health, they were tough. And, for me, it was tough. And for my wife, it was just as tough. And I think for my children, it was also very tough. But
and the prosecution as well. They must have destroyed themselves, the prosecution, because effectively they made fools of themselves as well, didn't they?
Yeah, but let me tell you, within 1 year, all of the people from the University of Cape Town who did charge me got increased. They increased something. They were made professors or whatever. They were given big awards. All of them were careers advanced. Not one of them's career went backwards. But they have started dying. That's
okay. The truth
my
will out.
co-author Marika Spora said there's that old Chinese proverb that if you sit long enough by the river, you see the bodies of your enemies coming floating by. And
well, that's how you stay positive.
If they're going to eat the grain-based diet with lots of sugar, they're not going to last. They're not going to last much beyond their 70s.
Well, let's talk about that then, because I love the fact that Dr. Ken Berry describes the keto diet as being the human diet, because I think that's true. And I know that, from my experience of human evolution through study, and also you live in the very kind of cradle of humanity, which is what a privilege that is. And I thought, the fact that you talk about human evolution would be a really good thing to get into, because actually this, I think, is one of the most fundamental arguments, I think, for a carnivore diet, which is why I tried to follow myself. But actually, without even going that far, it's actually pretty much an essential argument for why veganism is not good for us, because it is not part of our evolution. And the thing that I've said to many guests, and I'm sure you would agree, if you feed a cow the wrong diet for a cow, if you start feeding it a meat, it's going to get sick. If you feed a dog or a cat the wrong diet, you feed it grass, it's going to get sick. And it's really bizarre how humans think we can eat anything and we will still make lean, healthy muscle, as normal. But actually, evolutionary wise, that's clearly not the case, because we're not evolved to eat the diets that many of us are eating now, right?
Yeah. So, what's really interesting, my parents settled in Rhodesia, as it was then, at the end of the Second World War in 1946. And we had a small holding and next to the orthopedic surgeon for Salisbury. Right. And it turns out that in 1936, he was studying under Raymond Dart in Johannesburg at Wits. And his farm was near the Sterkfontein Caves. And he went to Dart and he said, Dart, I think you should go and examine the Sterkfontein Caves, because they had found the baboon that usually went with Homo Australopithecus africanus, the Southern African ape, Southern ape. And he said, we know that if you find that, you'll find Australopithecus. And within a few weeks, DART had went there and they started finding stuff. And anyway, so my father, he then came to Cape Town eventually. And my dad said, well, you must go and speak to him and he'll teach you that you should study medicine. So anyway, so that was the introduction. And so he used to educate me on anthropology and archaeology. And so that was where I became really interested right from the word go.
You're so lucky to have that on your doorstep. That is incredible. I'm very envious, Tim. I really am. Because
so I must make you even more envious. So one of my friends was Michael Thackeray, and his brother was Francis Thackeray. And they both used to run. And then Francis came to see me like a week before the Comrades Marathon, which is a 90-kilometer race. And he had a particular injury, and I used my magic and injected it. And by the way, the injections don't work, but they work in your head. And Francis finished the Comrades Marathon without expecting to. And he owed me something. And he became the head of the Transvaal Museum, which contains all these famous fossils, including Mrs. Ples. And he said, Tim, I'm going to allow you to come and I will go to the vault, which is like 15 doors through.
Yeah, I bet.
And there was Mrs. Ples, and I was able to hold Mrs. Ples's.
See, I've seen this skull. It's really small, isn't it?
Tiny,
really small. So I've heard the only one I've held, which was actually I found out after was a model, which I was very gutted by, was a Homo habilis skull, which was incredible to hold. I've held Roman real skulls and whatnot, and ancient artifacts and Saxon bones and things, but never. I mean, that's what 2 million years old.
2.1 million years.
Wow. What's the point of million between friends, Tim? So what 2.1. Now just to get this correct, Australopithecus afarensis is before that. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah, okay. And that's the first time we stood up and we were actually bipedal, although not very good. So how tall would Mrs. Ples have been?
About 3 foot, and she weighed about 30 kilograms.
And that ties into the idea of jungle dying, and suddenly they had to be bipedal to get access to resources.
So they were eating that jungle diet,
Wow. So can I just ask you a bit more then? So in your area, you would have had Australopithecus africanus. What about Homo habilis? What about the other Homo erectus and much later? Because I know about the Leakey's research and that's what I studied a lot. But in South Africa, what other hominid finds have there been?
The main Australopithecus africanus was the big breakthrough.
Right.
And I'm frankly not sure which other Homo habilis and so on. I suspect they were discovered. I know that the former professor at anatomy at Wits described Homo habilis, but he then went to East Africa to describe it. So I'm not sure what other major finds were made in South Africa, because I was interested in that area, the 4 million to 2 million years ago.
Now this ties into running, doesn't it? Because you then talk about how there's a link between how humans hunt. And actually what I love is because Dr. Michael Eads talks about the fact, and I think I'm going to sort of paraphrase this. He said along the lines, it's clear we didn't evolve to eat meat, but we evolved because we ate meat. And actually that's a key part of being a human being. Can you explain the running connection to how that's shaped our evolution?
Yeah, so we originally had a big, massive gut, where we would ferment the cellulose.
Like
down
gorillas
to
or chimpanzees now?
Absolutely. But we fermented to saturate fatty acids. And so all ruminants produce fats from carbohydrates. And what humans realized that they didn't have to do that themselves. As long as they caught these animals, ate the saturated fat, they would get the nutrients they needed. And that then allowed us to start running. That allowed us to get rid of this big gut and to replace it with a very small colon, quite a long small intestine, so where the digestion of meat occurs in the small intestine. But we didn't need the large colon for fermenting of the cellulose. And that meant we could get a smaller gut, and the pelvis also could come thinner, and that allowed us our knees to point forward and get this motion. So that was the key, and then we could start running. And as we began to run, we developed all the adaptations for coping with heat and not requiring to drink water frequently while we're running. And we had this ability to regulate our temperature because we sweat. And that was the key difference between us and antelope. We sweat, antelope don't sweat, so they will overheat. As long as you can chase them for long enough, they will overheat. But that requires huge effort. The temperature's got to be about 35 degrees centigrade to succeed, because you've only got 4 or 6 hours to hunt, because then the temperature drops and it gets evening. You have to catch them during between 10 and 4 in the afternoon. And so you have to chase them in that time, and you can't allow them to rest. They have to keep going. And that's the
Amazing.
way we caught them. And when eventually when they get so hot, they become completely, they won't fight with you and they won't spear you. So you can kill them quite easily.
What's amazing as well is that when you realize, when they look at hunter-gatherer societies, especially in the 19th century, before, the Western influence completely destroyed everything, and it really did. If there's a proof ever that wheat is toxic and sugar's toxic, then it's surely with these communities. But if you
Yeah.
look at Native American hunting, for instance, the communal element, when they, not the horse hunting, because of course that's much more recent, but when they do things like, trying to get buffaloes to go over cliff edges and stuff, the brain power in hunting like that was incredible. And it's so clever how human evolution is clearly eating meat and also working out logical puzzles to then survive and work together as a team. It's very powerful, isn't it?
Yeah, so I've just finished writing an article with Vicky Bendor, who's the authority on the mass extinction of megafauna. And he's come up with this theory, exactly as you're saying, that humans killed off all the megafauna, and they went for megafauna because they had a lot of fat on them. So we had plenty of
slow,
fat.
I guess, and easy to
And they were slow.
get. Yeah.
And they were easy to catch. So an elephant is easier to catch than an antelope, which is surprising. And they worked out how to kill these animals. And then eventually they killed them all off. Now they had to hunt the smaller, versatile animals. And that became much more difficult. And his theory is that caused the brain development. That was published like about 2 or 3 months ago. But the evidence that he presents is just it's absolutely clear. He talks about that we had this habitual diet. Then came the agricultural evolution occurred and we started eating grains. That was bad for us. But now we've gone through the processed food, the industrialized diet. And he said that's even worse. Yeah. So that's where we've come. We're now eating an industrial diet where when we came from the traditional human diet, was absolutely different.
But I also think people don't actually get the fundamentals of what evolution is. Evolution is natural selection. So some things die out and the things that are able to adapt survive. So we know that, for instance, Homo, is it robustus or Australopithecus robustus, was a vegetarian, wasn't he? With a massive mandible to chew the plants. That died out. So, and I just think, so evolution means that there's avenues which die out because they can't survive. So if we think we're going to eat processed foods and somehow we're going to just adapt to them, it's not. We're actually killing ourselves out, aren't we? Just like that's how evolution works. And the ones who don't eat that food will go on and succeed. And that's how evolution happens all the time. So, it's a pretty painful story, evolution, isn't it? And you don't want to go against it. 2 million years is a heck of a story we don't want to go against.
Exactly. No, precisely correct.
So I've got here a nice little quote that I thought you might find interesting. This is a quote by Neil Barnard, MD, and he said the following: "The beef industry has contributed to more American deaths than all the wars of this century." I think he's probably talking about the 20th century, I don't know. "All natural disasters and all automobile accidents combined. If beef is your idea of real food for real people, you better live real close to a real good hospital." What do you think about that?
Well, if it was true, we wouldn't be alive today, as you've described. So, I mean, it's just nonsense. So Neil Barnard is a front for that other organization against the treatment of animals. That's a front organization. And although he claims to be that his organization is full of doctors, it's not. It's full of lay people. So they have 1,000 doctors and 1,000 other people, members of his organization, but they're lay people. And that is the most stupid statement you could ever make. It has no basis. But Neil's quite good at distorting the evidence because he did a clinical trial over 70 weeks of diabetics put on the vegan diet. And it made absolutely no difference. At the end of 70 weeks, their HbA1c, which is a measure of their glucose control, was unchanged. There was no movement towards prevention or reversal of diabetes. But he's always writing, we know that the vegetarian diet or the vegan diet reverses diabetes on the basis of that study. It was a brilliantly done study, but it showed absolutely the opposite of what he claims.
So who's responsible then? Is that the journalist's fault for not reporting the story properly? Because it seems in this day and age, you can just put out a narrative. It doesn't matter if it's based in evidence. And we know in America, there have been certain political leaders who have done this as well. They put out a narrative, the narrative sticks, and then the science is left back in the bin, never touched. So who do you think is responsible for that then? Is it journalists who should be questioning better, like the Gary Taubes of this world, or is it the scientists themselves that are to blame?
Well, the scientists should be honest. I mean, I've just gone through The Women's Health Initiative is a study that's close to my heart because it was directed by a guy who debated me. When the university wanted to get rid of me, they flew this guy in from North America. And although he was a graduate of our university, he'd gone to America and headed up a $700 million clinical trial, $700 million trial.
Wow.
Now, Andreas Ehrenfeld warned me before I did the debate. He said, this study shows that the low-fat diet causes harm. I said, but where? He said, it's hidden in that paper. Go and read it. He showed it. And I published the article showing where this guy, the Women's Health Initiative, senior researchers that were hiding the evidence. Now, more recently, in 2017, they showed that the damages got even worse. Now they studied them from another 5 to 8 years. And they found that if you had heart disease and you went on the low-fat diet, your risk of having a subsequent event was 65% increased. 65% increase.
That should be everywhere. That should be everywhere.
Exactly right. Now, what did they do? They try to hide it.
How do they hide it? Sorry, just tell me as a layperson. Is it like just one little line somewhere that you just kind of, they say, in other news, did you realize X, Y, Z? Let's move on to the big picture. How do they hide it?
In the first paper in 2006, they did exactly that. They hid it right in the middle of the paper and excluded it from the abstract. And then they had a table, and I showed where they'd manipulated that table. And in the debate with this guy, I said, this is a problem. So he got up to, it's a printer's error. But this was this is 2012, and that was published in 2006. 6 years later, he had not corrected the printer's error, which is nonsense. Because if you had printed it properly, you would immediately see there's a problem here. Shocking. What they did in the most recent paper in 2017 was they said, we can't, the data are uninterpretable for various reasons. Now, they gave 2 false reasons. And their own data disproved what they were trying to argue. But unless you went through it carefully and you knew the literature, you would miss it. So that now, then what they did, was they divided these patients into 3 groups. And the group that did badly were the ones who had heart disease. So then in the final paper, they turfed them. They didn't include them. And then if you read the final paper, you would say, you see, this study, it proved that there are some benefits for low-fat diets for people with heart disease. There's some benefits. But that didn't show that at all. It showed it was harmful.
This reminds me of Ansel Keys, really, it does.
That's how it happens. And then that just gets perpetuated forever.
It reminds me of Ansel Keys then, but I kind of hope that the way that science would progress, especially because, let's be honest, Ansel Keys wasn't a scientist, was he?
No,
but with actual science, I kind of find it bizarre that with peer review and everything else, that there's not much more of a cross-questioning to get to the bottom of all this. It's still very much based on human ego and interest groups, which is quite worrying.
Well, peer review is meaningless because what happens, when I said this, I got criticized because this is the way it happens. So if I'm the editor of the British Medical Journal and I have a particular bent on a particular subject, a paper comes in which conflicts with that, I will send it to the 3 people or 4 people who I know will not like the findings, and they will reject the paper. On the other hand, if a paper comes in which I, as the editor, think I like this paper, I will send it to my 4 mates who agree with me, and it will get published. And that's how the system works. So the peer review is utterly hopeless. Yeah.
I just think this is shocking. I've got to be careful what I say here because I think I could say a lot, but I just think, but this is reality. If you look at the history of medicine, which I used to teach when I used to be a teacher, Semmelweis is a good example. Somebody who is saying, guys, if we don't clean our hands, we're killing these women who we're trying to help. And yet he goes to an asylum because people just think he's crazy. But time, though, is the best judge because time eventually will say, this was wrong. This person did it in their lifetime for the wrong reasons. But I think as long as you try to be on the side of truth, that's more important long-term than the short-term lie, surely. Well,
your short-term career depends on you continuing to tell the lies. That's the problem.
Oh, of course. It's your income. It's your income, isn't it?
Sorry?
It's your income. I just didn't think of that. Of course it is.
Absolutely. That's right. That's the problem. And I proved that. I lost all my funding the moment I started talking low carbs. Lost all my funding. And the Medical Research Council closed down my unit, which was one of the 3 most successful units in South Africa funded by the Medical Research Council. Now, if they were looking for truth, they would have said, Dr. Noakes, we don't care what you say about diet. You're such a good researcher. We'll keep supporting you. But they didn't. They shut it down. And they never said thank you for the 25 years of work and for all the achievements.
That's incredible. Now, obviously, you didn't go back there because that was all over, but you do work at another university now. Is that right?
That's right. So what happened was my son, he got so irritated by what he saw happen to me. He judged my emotion. He knew what had happened to me emotionally. And he is a media expert on media. That's what he did his PhD on. And he started looking into the question of online academic bullying because he saw me as being the primary case. And he researched it, and together we wrote a paper describing exactly what happened to me. And he used my case to define this is what online academic bullying is.
Yeah.
And it's now published. It's published a scientific article. And there are certain criteria. And if this is happening to you, you are being bullied online. And so now we can define it. So a person can come along to a university and say, listen, these are the criteria. I am being bullied online. What are you doing about it? And the answer is universities do absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
Absolutely nothing.
But then who judges them and who polices them? That's the problem. They police themselves.
No.
So ultimately, you can't get the bullies to, it's like, what power do you have really apart from mounting these people?
Nothing. But we could link this back to the low carb, sorry, the low fat groupings and the scientists who we were challenging.
Yeah. Right. So I was going to ask you something that when Gary Taubes came onto the show, he was, well, as you know, just amazing and inspirational. I love talking to Gary. And we were talking about Ancel Keys, who, is a very interesting character. And I know that you've done a lot of research into Ancel Keys, into his story. But the thing I was going to start with was, how did scientists get so fixed on the kind of carb paradigm that carbs were good and fat was bad? How on earth did this man have such a huge influence when he's not a scientist, he's not a medical doctor, he's using very shaky data, and yet he is influencing right now today what people are eating? How did that happen? I'm confused by that.
Yeah, I think what happened was he got the ear of the National Heart Institute in America. And he got all the funding, and then he put together a committee of 5 or 6 people, and they decided on all the funding that was directed to low fat studies were directed by this committee of 5 people, all of whom were his friends, and all of whom were dependent on his funding. So if we take it a step further, when Roosevelt died in 1945, he died of hypertension. And it was very embarrassing for the Americans because they didn't know how to treat their president. So Truman came along and 3 years later passed the NIH bill, which then put a whole lot of money came into research heart disease. And Ancel Keys was one of the people who had just lost his career because he'd been researching nutrition and military, etc., and starvation and so on.
He did the K ration, didn't he? Is that
correct.
Him? And also,
Which
didn't he
full
put
of
men
sugar?
Full of sugar, yeah, exactly. And didn't he also put men into psychosis by starving them? And he did some very bizarre things.
The famous
to people.
Minnesota starvation studies.
Yeah.
And that's what he was known for. Now, the problem was 1948, all this money now comes for heart disease, and he's not researching heart disease. And there is a guy called John Goffman who has already described all the lipoproteins for the HDL, LDL, and who's way ahead and has shown that some of these things change with diet and some of them predict heart disease, although poorly, but anyway. And so he's the leading guy. And now Keys knows he has to displace him. He decides the easiest way to do that is to do epidemiology because he didn't you don't need any training to be an epidemiologist. So he sees this one figure, the famous figure of saturated fat and heart disease. He extracts it and manipulates it, and then that becomes the story. And he convinces everyone that he's correct, that epidemiology proves that saturated fat causes heart disease. And he sells it to the National Institute of Heart, and they fund all the clinical trials are run by 5 or 6, group of 5 or 6, all of them are tied to Keys. And they know that if they don't support Keys, they don't get funding. And that's how it starts. And what Gary Taubes makes the point is no one ever chose to do a study of sugar. There's no long-term study of sugar extraction from the diet or increase, none at all. So the sugar industry was also helpful in suppressing the argument that sugar might be dangerous and promoting the idea that fat would be the problem. So industry gets behind it. And then, of course, the pharmaceutical industry gets behind it because now they've got a target cholesterol and they've got a product, statins, which can so-called lower it. And then it becomes all embedded. And that's it. You can't change that.
Wow. And then we have consensus again, consensus
Yeah.
rather than science. But the thing is, though, there's an early step there that I don't get. How is it that good scientists didn't really shout out to say, this is epidemiology, we can't depend on this for anything?
Yeah.
There's that key
Well,
bit before it caught. How wasn't it just flattened early on?
well, the only person challenging it really was Yadkin in the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
And the sugar industry got after him because he targeted sugar. He didn't just target carbohydrates, he targeted sugar. And he said that sugar is strongly related because saturated fat intake and sugar intake are almost identical in any country.
Yeah.
Countries with high saturated fat intake have a high sugar intake. And he showed that, and he was shut down by industry, who working through the Medical Research Council in England. So in your own country, that the Medical Research Council was corrupted by sugar interests. And they took out Yadkin. And that what Yadkin, everyone realized what happened to me, people realized you don't challenge the system or you're finished. And Yadkin was demonized, absolutely demonized. And the words were exactly, he's a quack, he's a pseudoscientist, exactly the same words that were used about me to the letter.
And by the way, you can make a career over 40 years, but you're named a quack and the next day you're a quack. It's very quick, isn't it? You're just written off overnight.
Absolutely.
Which brings me on to Atkins as well then, because he is the man who really probably most people have heard about first. And yet I know the least about him. And yet he was a real pioneer in all of this. And yet he has been completely demonized as well. If you used to ask the layperson on the street to tell me about Atkins, they'll say, oh, he had that high fat thing, which works, but he died of a heart attack. Yeah. That's what you know, isn't it? So, what can you tell me about Atkins and his impact in this story?
So Atkins is a really interesting guy because he was a very clever kid. And he gained access to one of the major universities, which was unusual. And when he got there, he went into medical practice and became very depressed. And the day that President Kennedy was murdered, he was sitting watching television and he said, I'm fat and I'm lazy and I'm lethargic and I don't like life. I've got to lose weight. But he said, I can only lose weight if I don't get hungry. So he went to the library.
Smart man.
He said, he went to the library and he looked up, what drives appetite and what drives satiety? And he found the word ketones. And then he said, oh, ketones. And then he found that low carbs raise ketones. So he said, okay, well, I'm going to try a low carb diet. And he lost all his weight very quickly. And then he realized this was the solution. And then he set up his medical practice in New York, treating patients with diabetes, and was profoundly successful. And was becoming incredibly successful shortly before his death. And the Atkins diet was almost tipping and becoming the dominant diet. But he died, and then that was it again, because they tackled him and said he had a heart attack. He didn't. He had a viral infection of his heart. And so he had some heart failure, and then he fell and hit his head and died from a brain bleed. But it was nothing to do with his heart. But it is true, he did have some heart failure, but it was unrelated to his diet. Ironically, we now know that ketosis helps a weakened heart. So his diet would have helped his heart rather than cause problems.
It's amazing. And I just think, if he'd lived a little bit longer, maybe that would have changed things massively. Then maybe that tipping point would have come sooner. So in a way, it's now called the keto diet rather than the Atkins diet, but it's pretty much the same, isn't it? There's not...
That's absolutely the same. Yeah, that's correct.
So there's no it's just rebranding it slightly. I asked this to Gary when he was on, and I said, is it true that Ancel Keys changed his mind towards the end of his life? And Gary said he's not entirely sure that the journalist reported that correctly or not. What do you think about that? Do you think Ancel Keys maybe looked at it and questioned what he'd done?
He did. He said, I don't think that we've made too much of cholesterol. That was the words he said. And I think it's in Gary's book, or if it's not in his book, I've certainly read it as well. And it was Blackburn who said it. And Blackburn had worked with Keys at the University of Minnesota. And Blackburn said that Keys had said to him, I think we've made too much of the cholesterol story.
Wow. So that's interesting that he has made something which has killed millions of people. I mean, that quote about beef has caused more death than all the wars. Now, I don't know figures here, but I'd be very interested to see the metabolic syndrome and how much suffering it's caused, not just death, but how many people are living in chronic pain and real suffering going on because of that paradigm. And it's affected generations of people.
Yeah. There's a quarter of a billion people with type 2 diabetes on the earth now. Quarter of a billion. And all of them will die of the complications.
Isn't it true you die of the treatment, not the disease, because the way it's managed?
That's correct, yeah. Your diabetes doesn't kill you. As long as you get on a low carb diet and treat with medicine, but not with insulin, there's no reason why you shouldn't live a normal life.
Wow, incredible.